The night my brother decided to make me the joke of his own engagement party was the same night I decided to stop being the reason he could afford to throw one. He was standing near the bar, already 2 drinks in, already performing the version of himself he saved for rooms full of people he wanted to impress. His fiancée was beside him in a pale green dress, laughing at everything he said the way she always did when the right audience was watching. My mother had arranged the whole evening, the floral arrangements, the caterers, the venue deposit, all of it presented to their friends, as a gift from our family. I knew exactly what that presentation cost because I had been the one covering the actual invoices. I was near the window with a glass of sparkling water I had barely touched, watching the room the way I always watched rooms in that family, from the edges, taking inventory. Then my brother tapped his glass and called for attention, and I thought, finally, a toast, a thank you, something that looked like acknowledgement. Instead, he smiled at the crowd, looked directly at me, and said, "Some of us were born to build things, and some of us were born to crunch numbers in a cubicle and call it a career." The laughter was polite and brief, the kind that happens when nobody is sure if something was a joke or not. My mother smiled into her champagne. His fiancée tilted her head at me with something that looked almost like pity. I did not move. I did not laugh. I stood there and thought about a folder on my laptop named simply House. Inside that folder was everything, every wire transfer, every emergency payment. Every quiet rescue that kept his charmed life from collapsing before anyone with a camera phone could notice. By the time dessert arrived, I had made a decision that had been building for 3 years. Before I tell you what happened after I walked out of that party, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed quiet to protect someone who never once thought to protect you? Think about that while I take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a suburb of Dallas, in a household that ran on appearances and aspiration. My mother built her catering company, a modest but well-regarded operation called Breyer and Table, from scratch after my father left when I was 11. She was extraordinary at it in the way that people who survive something terrible sometimes become extraordinary. She could walk into an empty ballroom and see the finished event before a single chair was unfolded. What she could not do, and never wanted to learn, was the financial side. The books, the vendor contracts, the quarterly taxes, the insurance renewals, all of it made her tired in a way that the actual work never did. My brother stepped into that gap the way he stepped into everything, loudly, visibly, and with just enough surface competence to satisfy a room. He redesigned the logo, launched a social media presence, and filmed a local morning segment that made Breyer and Table feel like a lifestyle brand instead of a catering company. People started calling it charming. My mother started calling my brother her partner. He bought himself a good camera, started accepting speaking invitations at local business panels, and positioned himself as an entrepreneur with vision. I became a senior financial analyst at a commercial real estate firm downtown. I worked long hours, lived below my means, and had the kind of income that looked modest from the outside because I kept it quiet. I had student loans paid off at 27. I had a 6-month emergency fund before my 29th birthday. I understood exactly what numbers meant, and exactly what happened to businesses that ignored them. The first time my mother called me about a cash problem, I was 26. A vendor had demanded payment in full for a large order that had already been delivered and invoiced to a client who was late paying. The gap was $4,000. She said it would only take 2 weeks. I transferred the money before I went to bed that night because I was 26 and still believed her when she said things like only in 2 weeks and I'll handle it from here. The 2 weeks became 6. The 4,000 became a pattern. By the time I was 28, I had a spreadsheet I updated every quarter because I needed to see the real number with my own eyes in order to believe it. The spreadsheet was not dramatic. It was just columns: date, category, amount, purpose. Equipment lease gap, payroll shortfall from a slow November. Insurance renewal my mother forgot to budget for. A second van the company needed after one broke down in April. My brother's new camera equipment, expensed through the business account and categorized as marketing. A branding consultant he hired after watching one YouTube video about scaling. The retainer for an attorney after a catering client disputed a contract. a dispute that was eventually settled in the company's favor, but only after 6 months of fees I covered, without being asked. The total, the last time I added it up before the engagement party, was $112,000 over 3 years. That number lived in my chest the way a piece of glass lives in a wound that never fully healed. I could feel it every time my mother introduced my brother to someone new and said he was the one who really turned things around. He never corrected her. That night, driving home from the engagement party with the windows down and the freeway lights making long orange lines on the hood of my car, I called my closest friend from college, a woman named Danny who had spent 5 years in corporate law before burning out and becoming a yoga instructor, and who remained the most practical person I had ever met in either of her careers. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything in the parking garage under my building, sitting in the driver's seat without turning the engine off. The toast, the cubicle line, the laughter, the way my mother had smiled. Danny did not spend any time validating my feelings or telling me I deserved better, she said. How much total? And do you have documentation? I told her the number. I heard her exhale slowly. That is not a favor, she said. That is a business arrangement that one party was never informed they were in. Stop one thing tonight before you lose your nerve. I knew exactly what to stop. I had set up an automatic transfer into the business operating account 18 months earlier, after a particularly bad quarter left my mother unable to cover payroll for her 3 part-time staff. I had never told my brother about it. My mother knew, but we had never discussed it in terms of what it actually was. I logged in from my phone in the parking garage and canceled the transfer scheduled for the following Friday. Then I sat there for another minute and canceled the one after that. Then I went upstairs, opened my laptop, and did something I had been avoiding for 3 years. I printed everything. My home printer took 40 minutes and ran low on ink twice. I had to rearrange the pages twice on my kitchen table before I had a version organized by category and date. Even unbound, even slightly out of order, it looked like what it was. Evidence of a thing that had been happening to someone who pretended it wasn't. Danny came over the next morning with coffee and the kind of expression that means someone is about to tell you something uncomfortable and useful. She sat across from my kitchen table, looked at the pages, and said quietly, "He has no idea what you've done, or he does and he doesn't care. Either one is a problem for you." By Sunday afternoon, my phone had 3 messages from my mother about a vendor payment that was coming due Tuesday. I did not respond. 2 hours later, a text from my brother. "Did you see Mom's message? She needs help with the Henderson's invoice bridge." I read it 3 times. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "About the other night." Just, "She needs help." As if nothing had happened, as if nothing ever did. I called my mother on Sunday evening. She answered with the slightly wounded tone she used when she thought I was being difficult. I told her calmly that I had canceled the automatic transfers and that any outstanding vendor invoices were the company's responsibility to manage. She said she didn't understand what I meant. I said I meant that I was no longer covering operating costs. She said, "But the Hendersons' party is in 11 days. I said I knew that. She said, "How are we supposed to manage 11 days from now without the bridge?" I said, "That's what a business line of credit is for." She went quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't think you appreciate how hard your brother has worked." I did not respond to that. I told her I loved her and that I would talk to her soon, and I ended the call. My brother tried the next morning with a different approach. He called instead of texted, which meant he had already realized texts could be ignored more easily. I let it ring once, then answered. He started with, "So Mom tells me you're having some kind of reaction to what I said at the party." A reaction, as if I were a person who had eaten something that disagreed with me. He said he had been joking, and that I was always too sensitive about anything to do with my career, and that this wasn't the time to let personal feelings interfere with the business. I said, "Tell me something. When you talked about the company on that morning segment last spring, you said Breyer and Table had been entirely self-funded since the beginning. Is that what you believe?" A pause. Then, more carefully, "What does that have to do with anything?" I said, "I'm just trying to understand what you think you know about how the last 3 years have actually worked." He said he didn't have time for whatever this was. and that we would talk at Sunday dinner. I said that was fine. Sunday dinner was at my mother's house, the same table I had eaten at my entire childhood, now updated with the placemats my brother's fiancé had chosen, and a new pendant light he had expensed through the company as an office improvement. My mother had made pot roast. The house smelled exactly the way it always had on Sunday evenings. I had brought a slim envelope. My brother started before the food was even passed. He said I had been cold to my mother all week, that it was affecting the team's ability to operate, and that whatever was going on with me needed to be set aside for the sake of the business. My mother nodded carefully, without looking at me. His fiancée examined her water glass. I set my fork down and said, "I'd like to understand something before we move forward. Do either of you know what the company's actual cash position would be without outside support over the past 36 months? My brother's jaw tightened. We've had a strong 3 years. Because someone covered the gaps. My mother said, quickly, "Claire, families help each other. That's not something to throw in anyone's face." I looked at her. Did I choose to cover the payroll shortfall in November, 2 years ago? Or did you call me on a Thursday night and say you didn't know what to tell the staff if the direct deposits didn't go through? Her face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. I looked at my brother. Did I choose to pay the attorney retainer on the Henderson contract dispute, or did you tell me it was only going to be a month and that you would handle the repayment yourself? He leaned back in his chair with the careful posture of someone deciding which version of denial costs the least. You offered those things. You were never pressured. There it was, the version of the story where I was a volunteer. I slid one page from the envelope and placed it in the center of the table. Not the full document, just a single summary page. Date, category, amount, purpose. My mother leaned forward slightly to read it. My brother did the same, and I watched his expression move through something that looked like scorn, and then slowed down somewhere closer to calculation. "These numbers aren't accurate," he said. "They match bank records with transfer IDs and confirmation numbers attached. You're exaggerating individual things to make a pattern that doesn't exist." I said. "Say out loud that the company has never received financial support from me. Say it at this table." He didn't. The silence lasted long enough that my mother set down her fork. I stood up before dessert and told them that the automatic transfers had been canceled, that any operating expenses going forward were the company's to manage, and that I was not available as a bridge account. My brother said I was being vindictive over a joke that wasn't even worth remembering. I said the joke wasn't the problem. The problem was that he made it standing on money I had wired. I left before the pot roast got cold. 2 days later, the real pressure started. My mother called 4 times on Tuesday. My brother sent a series of texts that moved through irritation, then urgency, then something that sounded almost like reasoning. The vendor had called. The insurance renewal was in 3 weeks. There was a large event on the calendar, a corporate dinner for 60 people, and the client deposit didn't cover the full supply cost. "Just this one," he wrote. "We'll have the client balance by the 15th. I did not reply. That afternoon, my friend Danny called and told me she had a contact, a woman named Joanna who worked in business documentation and had once helped Danny with a contract dispute. Clean, organized, no drama. I called her the same evening. Joanna came to my apartment on Wednesday with 2 coffees and a set of tabbed file folders. She spent 4 hours with me going through everything I had, organizing it into a form that was clear and sequential and impossible to argue with. She was the kind of person who spoke less the more serious things got, and by the time we were through the insurance section, she had gone almost completely quiet. "The issue," she said eventually, "isn't just that they accepted money. It's that the business presented itself publicly as self-sustaining. Your brother's morning segment, the panel he spoke on last fall about small business resilience, your mother's interview with the community paper." She turned her laptop toward me. I read the quote from my mother in the community paper. "We've never taken a dime from outside the business. Everything we have, we built ourselves." I had read that interview when it ran. I had thought about it for a few days, and then put it somewhere I didn't have to look at it. "That," Joanna said, "is a public statement that contradicts documented reality." She paused. "How are you feeling?" I told her I was fine. She said, "Good. Because what you do next matters, and you need to be steady for it." The event that made everything irreversible was already booked. The following Friday, Briar and Table was catering the opening dinner for a new mixed-use development on the north side of Dallas. The developer, a man my brother had spent 6 months cultivating as a client, had hired them specifically because of their reputation. My brother had already started dropping the developer's name in his Instagram captions and calling it a milestone. Several of my mother's longtime vendor contacts would be there. So would a woman my brother had recently started describing as a potential investor in a Briar and Table expansion. I knew about the dinner because I had seen the contract when my brother emailed it to me, asking me to check the liability language. 3 months ago, before the engagement party, before the toast, before I stopped pretending I didn't know what was happening, Joanna looked at the event on the calendar and said, simply, "You've already given them a private opportunity." She was right. Sunday dinner had been the private opportunity. They had used it to call me a liar and wait for me to come back around. I expanded the documentation into a full binder over the next 48 hours. Joanna organized it. Section 1. Personal financial transfers with bank confirmation. Section 2. Business expenses covered without formal agreement. Section 3. Public statements made by the company about its financial independence, printed and dated. Section 4. My formal written notice withdrawing all future financial support. Notarized, dated, signed. The binder was 3/4 of an inch thick. When the printer at Joanna's office spat out the last page, she stacked everything carefully, looked at me, and said, "You don't have to do it there. You could send a formal letter." I said I knew that. She nodded once and started organizing the tabs. My brother called me Thursday evening. His tone had shifted again into something more reasonable, the version he used when he was recalibrating. He said he understood I had some feelings about the party, that the comment had been thoughtless, and that he was sorry if it came across wrong. If. That word sat in my ear like a splinter. He said he hoped I could be at the opening dinner to support the family, that it would mean a lot to their mother, and that the investor conversation went better with all of us present. I said I would be there. The venue was a renovated warehouse space with exposed brick and pendant lighting, the kind of place that photographed well and knew it. My mother and her team had done the food beautifully past appetizers, a plated main course, a dessert display along one wall that I knew she had been planning for weeks. She looked proud and tired in equal measure, the way she always looked at events. My brother was in a blazer I hadn't seen before, moving through the room like a man who believed he had already won something. I arrived 20 minutes after the start, late enough for the room to have settled into its conversations. My brother saw me across the room and gave me the nod that meant good. "You're here, play your part." The potential investor was near the bar. A composed woman in her 50s with the kind of quiet attention that meant she had been evaluating everything since she walked in. The developer was at the center of the room, talking to 2 of my mother's longest-standing vendor contacts. My mother reached me first. She touched my arm and said, quietly, "Please just let tonight be tonight." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I love you. That hasn't changed." She looked uncertain, which was the most honest thing she had looked in 2 weeks. My brother made his way over shortly after and steered me toward the investor, with one hand light on my shoulder and a sentence that began, "My sister works in finance, so she can speak to the business side of what we're building." He said it the way someone sets a decorative object on a shelf usefully placed, not particularly valued. The investor looked at me with interest. My brother kept talking, and in the middle of a sentence about growth projections and the company's track record of financial independence, something inside me went very still. I waited until he finished the sentence. Then I said, calmly and without raising my voice, "I want to make sure we're being accurate with you, since you're considering an investment." My brother turned his head toward me. The investor's expression did not change, but her full attention shifted. "The company has had outside financial support for the past 3 years. I'm the one who provided it. It totals just over $100,000. That support has ended as of 2 weeks ago, and I have documentation of all of it. The quiet that followed was the kind that happens in a room when a sound cuts through the ambient noise, and everyone realizes it at the same moment. The developer had turned. One of the vendor contacts had gone still. My brother said with a very controlled voice, "That is not an accurate characterization." I reached into my bag and placed the binder on the table beside us. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just set it down the way you set down something that has weight. I opened to the summary page and turned it toward the investor. My brother put one hand on the binder. "These are private family matters, and they are not relevant here," I said. "They're directly relevant to any representation of the company's financial independence." The investor picked up the binder with both hands and began to read. My brother said my name once, tightly, and I looked at him and said, "You called it self-funded in front of a camera. You said it in interviews. You said it at this table 2 weeks ago when you told me I had never been pressured." He looked at the binder in the investor's hands, and then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, something closer to fear. He said, "You are doing this here on purpose." I said, "You did it on purpose, at the engagement party. The difference is I have receipts." The developer had drifted closer. He was reading over the investor's shoulder. My mother appeared from somewhere near the food tables, assessed the situation in one glance, and went pale. My brother's fiancée was beside him now, her hand on his arm, her eyes moving between the binder and my face. The investor turned to the last section, the formal notice of withdrawal, and read it slowly. Then she set the binder on the table, straightened, and said to my brother, very quietly, "You told me this morning the company had been cash flow positive without outside support for 3 consecutive years." My brother started a sentence. She raised one hand slightly, and he stopped. She looked at the developer. He gave her a small nod. She picked up her clutch from the table, said, "I need to reconsider the timing on this," and walked toward the exit with the kind of composure that meant the conversation was over. My brother turned to me. For one moment I thought he was going to say something true. Instead, he said, "I hope you're proud of yourself." I said, "I hope you build something real." Then I picked up the binder, thanked my mother's catering team on the way out because they had done beautiful work and none of this was their fault, and walked out into the cool October air of a Dallas parking lot. I sat in my car for 3 minutes. My hands were steady this time. The month that followed was not pleasant and not dramatic. It was just consequence, doing what consequence does when it is finally allowed to move at its own pace. The investor withdrew. The developer scaled back the event relationship to a single contract arrangement with no ongoing commitment. 2 vendor contacts who had overheard the conversation at the dinner renegotiated their credit terms with the company, apparently having decided that the financial picture warranted more caution. My brother had been managing the books with a confidence that depended on my quiet presence underneath them. Without it, the actual state of the company became visible to anyone who looked. He called me once more, about 3 weeks after the dinner. He was outside, I could hear traffic. His voice had lost the performing quality it usually carried. He said he had talked to a business consultant, and that the news was not good. He did not apologize. He said, "You could have come to me privately." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I came to you privately at Sunday dinner. You told me I was exaggerating." He didn't answer that. I said, "I'm not your emergency account." "I never agreed to be," he said. "You're really okay with watching this fall apart." I said, "I'm okay with not watching it fall apart on top of me anymore." He hung up. My mother and I had a real conversation about 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in her kitchen with the television off and no performance required of either of us. She cried once, briefly, and then stopped and looked at me in a way that I recognized as the real version of her, the one that existed before reputation became the primary project. She said she had known, on some level, and that she had told herself it was temporary, and then stopped asking. She said she didn't know how to thank me for what I had done. I told her I hadn't needed thanks. I had needed honesty, and there was a difference. She said she understood that now. We sat together for a while without fixing anything, which felt more honest than anything we had done in years. Briar and table did not fold. My mother was a real operator, and once the actual financial picture was visible, she was able to make real decisions. She let my brother's camera equipment go back on the company lease return. She renegotiated 2 vendor contracts herself without consulting him. She brought in a bookkeeper 2 days a week. She told me later that it was the first time in 4 years she had understood what the company actually had. She sounded lighter when she said it. My brother eventually found his version of the story, the one where I had been too sensitive and overreacted and embarrassed the family publicly over a private matter. I heard it secondhand a few times. I didn't correct it in his circles. The documentation existed. The people who needed to know the truth already did. I moved into a new apartment in the spring, not far from where I had been living, but with a small balcony that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made getting up feel like something other than preparation for other people's problems. I took on 2 additional clients through the firm and saved the extra income in an account I did not share with anyone. Danny came over for dinner one Friday and looked around the apartment and said, "You look different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You look like someone who isn't waiting for a phone to ring." I kept 1 page from the binder in the drawer of my desk. Not as a weapon, not as a wound, as a reminder. It was the summary page, the one that had turned faces pale in a renovated warehouse in Dallas on an October Friday. I keep it because there is something I never want to forget. That I had spent 3 years making myself invisible in order to hold something together for people who were performing for the room while I was keeping the lights on. I do not keep it because I am angry. I keep it because I am not anymore. I want to leave you with something before I go. If your family has ever handed you the invisible role, the dependable one, the practical one, the one who understands numbers and stays late and never makes a scene, I want you to consider something. That role was never a compliment, it was an assignment. And you are allowed to resign. Not because they deserve what follows, but because you deserve what comes after. The money I stopped sending was the most valuable thing I ever gave myself, not because it stayed in my account. Because leaving it there meant I finally had proof of what I already knew. That I was never the problem in that family. I was the solution they refused to name.